Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I just got to Paris about an hour ago, so really excited to see that the weather's a little better than last year and that everybody's so excited for another ECC. I'm AJ Warner, Chief Strategy Officer at Off-Chain Labs. We only have about 15 minutes, and I love to keep a lot of time for question and answers, so I'm probably going to move through this pretty quickly because I'd love to talk to you folks a lot more. There's a lot of components about scaling businesses with layer 2 roll-up technology, the business on top of it. I'll tell you the things I'm not going to talk about today. A lot of my colleagues are talking about them on other panels, and they've been widely discussed. I'm going to not talk about MEV around sequencer revenues as well as shared sequencing mechanisms. Those are just my colleagues have been more focused on the technical components. Have been talking about that. The areas I'm going to talk about is sort of building out what it means to have roll-up ecosystems, how they can scale, how they can grow, and specifically my experiences working with Arbitrum in particular. One caveat I want to flag before, obviously, in March we had a transition where Off-Chain Labs was the stewards of the Arbitrum protocol, and it's been transitioned to control by the Arbitrum DAO. So I work for Off-Chain Labs, which is a service provider, so some of that context is important as to the forward-looking components of everything that we're doing. Very briefly, before we hop into the core part, what is a rollup? What is a scaling Ethereum? The key part is you're trying to separate execution and data availability. So when you do a transaction on Arbitrum, it sits on top of Ethereum, and all transactions are batched together and posted to Ethereum. This allows the transaction fees to come down somewhere between 25 and 100x, depending on what you're doing. Obviously, you have a proving mechanism that's remains supported in Ethereum, so you can have the full experience without compromising on the security levels that Ethereum gains once, obviously, the rollup is fully built out. The differences between a rollup and a sidechain really come down to 4 key components. It's just data availability on Arbitrum 1, which is a rollup protocol that lives on Ethereum. L1 and L2 bridging. When you have a bridge, it doesn't get bridged by a multi-sig control over the bridge. It's a self-enforcing bridge, which you enforce from Ethereum itself. We utilize fraud proofs for security mechanisms. And the honesty assumptions are you only need one honest validator, which is a huge distinction from a sidechain protocol, which typically has a 2/3 honesty majority assumption. And that's one of the key drivers. Right now, Arbitrum 1, the DAO has a whitelist on who can be validators, but assuming that comes off soon, as long as you are running a validator yourself, you have to trust no one other than yourself to submit a challenge to the Ethereum protocol. So Arbitrum 1. These are the current state of the network today. Is about $6 billion of value bridged from Ethereum to Arbitrum. There's a lot of different rollups that keep popping up into the ecosystem. Arbitrum 1 currently has over 60% of the market share, according to L2Beat. Thousands of applications and almost 10 million different addresses using the network. So when you think about going back, I've been working on this for about 2.5 years. The flywheel mechanisms that we always believed in was you need to have, from an onboarding experience, traditional layer 1 applications or other ecosystem applications moving over, working with infrastructure, and ultimately the core vision is to have major applications come out of the network itself. So you can see in terms of what we call the blue chips that everybody knows from the crypto ecosystems, Uniswap, Sushi, OpenSea, Aave, etc. That join the network together with a lot of infrastructure. Chainlink, Infura, Alchemy, Etherscan, really everything that you need in order to have a traditional EVM experience. But what I'm most proud about is the success of the native Arbitrum networks. Applications, GMX, TreasureDAO are leaders in their verticals and perpetuals and gaming ecosystems combined. And it's really amazing to see how using layer 2 technology, additional computation and throughput has allowed a lot of different verticals, particularly derivatives in DeFi, to take off on Arbitrum. If you look here, just one more chart specifically about liquidity. The Arbitrum 1 liquidity, this is about a month old, so it's a little bit off. Arbitrum 1 has about 1.15 million ETH, which is almost $2.5 billion at today's price, bridged in. And this is a comparison with all other major networks that are focusing on scaling the EVM combined. And we are very proud of the adoption that Arbitrum has seen to date. This is an interesting chart to show sort of how we've focused on different applications that we've targeted. And I put the charts side by side intentionally because, as you can see on the chart on the left, if you look at the amount of transactions over the last, let's say, 3 to 4 months, Ethereum and Arbitrum are actually quite similar. But if you look to the right and you look at the daily gas that's used, Arbitrum is significantly higher. The reason why Ethereum's line is flat is because basically there's always a congestion. right? And then the fee mechanism kicks in. But Arbitrum actually uses, despite having the same number of transactions, it uses much more computationally intensive transactions. And I think that's one of the key things that people don't focus on when they think about the power of rollups and scaling technologies, is we're not only having more throughput living on Ethereum, the types of transactions that are taking a lot of gas can actually really only exist on layer 2 technologies. A lot of that is accounted for in derivatives because they take a lot of gas. A typical GMX transaction would probably cost 100 to 150 times more if it was done on Ethereum mainnet. As you can see in terms of volume, there's a huge growth in layer 2 technology volume over Ethereum. This is from Uniswap in terms of the amount of volume that layer 2 are taking in the DEX markets. This is an example. So, when we started working on the Arbitrum network, we were really focused on scaling the Web3 native environment and ecosystem. But as the technology has continued to mature, we've worked with other institutions. For example, the Norwegian government is currently testing 2 products on Arbitrum testnets. They're building something called Brock, which is focused on registration of private companies to make it much more accessible to get this data, and are also testing how do they bridge their CBDC token into a public network from a private network that we're currently working on for deployment purposes. So while Arbitrum 1 is really great and has been focused on building out the Arbitrum ecosystem mainly around DeFi, there are certain things and certain use cases that are still too expensive to post all of their call data to Ethereum. So that's what Arbitrum Nova, which is an AnyTrust technology, is intended to solve. This is really a technology for very high throughput dApps with a consumer focus or gaming. Basically, cheap transactions being a necessity in order for the use case to survive. How do we do this? So the reason why Nova works differently than Ethereum, than Arbitrum 1, is it doesn't post all the call data to Ethereum, it posts the call data to a data availability committee. And on Arbitrum Nova, these are the members of the data availability committee, and the principles are you need 2 members of the data availability committee to remain honest, and anyone has the ability to force the protocol into a rollup mode. So how does it work? When you submit a transaction on Arbitrum Nova, the transaction goes to these members of the committee. They submit certificates to Ethereum that they've had the transactions, and they're posting the certificates there, and they ensure and are required to keep that data available. Again, any single member of this committee, any validator, can force the protocol into rollup mode if the committee starts to act maliciously. But the introduction of a data availability committee brings the cost down by another factor of 10. So a typical transaction on Arbitrum Nova is sub-penny. And this has been really important for gaming and for social apps. So I'll give an example that Beacon, they've done a lot of work on Arbitrum, and they've really been one of the examples of the growing gaming ecosystem that lives on Arbitrum today. They sold out millions of dollars worth of their initial NFTs in the alpha stage, and the game is continuing to grow. We have a number of upcoming titles, some very famous ones, Pirate Nation, which actually recently just launched. Forgotten Runes is launching the Goblin Town, Zverse. ZTX is actually a Korean social and metaverse that has launched, that announced last week that they're launching an Arbitrum, which we're extremely excited about. A lot of this is taking advantage of the Arbitrum Nova infrastructure stack because the costs are about 10 times cheaper than Arbitrum 1 and probably between 100 and 150 times cheaper than Ethereum mainnet itself. This is the technology that Reddit chose to use for scaling their community points. They've started with 2 subreddits that are currently on chain, one for the cryptocurrency subreddit and the Fortnite subreddits. And then when they initially introduced this, they had 250,000 wallets that they submitted tokens to, and it cost about 1,600 transactions to fund all 250,000 wallets. So really about a sixth of a penny per wallet. We've spoken a lot about scaling the Arbitrum networks and scaling the developer experience. Right now I want to focus on how on the user experience. I want to focus on how we're thinking about scaling at Off-Chain Labs the developer experience as well. And this is the introduction of Stylus. With Stylus, we are going to add an additional virtual machine into the Arbitrum tech stack, which will allow you to program in Rust, C, and C++ and have those transactions live side by side with the EVM. So if you want to continue coding the EVM, Solidity, you don't see any changes to your networks, but you can interact and have precompiles that are written in other languages with significant cost savings as well. We think that this is really important for onboarding a lot more devs because right now you have the trade-off between using an ecosystem like Solana, which is only Rust-based, or an ecosystem like Arbitrum or Ethereum, which is very focused on the EVM. This will allow you to have both synchronously and composably. One other area of scale that we're starting to see is application chains. In the off-chain labs in the Arbitrum ecosystem, we have something called Arbitrum Orbit, which is a set of layer 3 technologies that live on top of Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova. So why would you want your own app chain? One of the advantages is you can have more flexibility. So for example, if you want to introduce Stylus, Stylus on the public chains is going to have to get approval from the Arbitrum DAO. If you want to build your own chain, take advantage of Arbitrum Stylus, you want to sort of do whatever you want to that code base, you have the ability to do that. You also have increased gas reliability. Even though Arbitrum scales Ethereum's throughput by about 7x on each chain, you might not want to have unpredictability of public networks and congestion, so you can have much more control about whether that's the case. Account abstraction. The Arbitrum DAO actually just recently approved adding account abstraction into the Arbitrum sequencer, but things like that are possible, much more flexible to do on your own chain, as well as customizable protocol logic. You can do whatever you want to change governance, settlement, execution, introduction of alternative data availability committees. All of these things you can do on top of the Arbitrum Orbit protocol. Two others, decentralization options. You can choose to use Arbitrum Rollup, Arbitrum AnyTrust. You can do what you want to introduce either from a regulatory and compliance perspective, and it's super easy to spin up in your own. We actually have a one-click deployment tool. Obviously, it doesn't cover the DevOps side. You have to make sure that that's an ongoing component, but we can make it super easy to spin one up. Security, you can use any of these chains right out of the box, and if you want to have permissioned access, we're seeing this in fintech a lot, where they need to have certain requirements for rules and regulations for who can interact with the specific chain. You can introduce all of those things into the Orbit stack. There are some frictions though, and I don't want to pretend these don't exist. One is cross-chain friction. There's a lot less liquidity obviously on your app chain than there would be on the public networks. Working with liquidity providers to figure out how to bridge that gap is going to be critical, as well as infrastructure complexity. The Arbitrum Foundation, the Arbitrum ecosystem has block explorers, oracles, indexers, everything that you really need in the EVM experience to really survive and thrive. You're going to have to make sure that all of those are available. There's a bunch of rollup as a service providers that are doing a really good job at this. But I do want to highlight these are some of the complexities of running your own application chain that we're seeing today amongst developers that are looking at it. Well, thank you very much for coming and listening to me, and I'd love to, if we have time, answer any questions.
Can we have one? Yeah, okay, this one will do. Okay, any questions? Yep, all right.
Hi, just a quick question. I was wondering what was the potential future of Arbitrum 1 with Arbitrum Nova. At the end of the day, are you expecting Arbitrum 1 to disappear? Well, everybody to move to Arbitrum Nova? What are the use cases that, and if it's not the case, what are the use cases that will be addressed by Arbitrum 1 versus Nova?
That's a great question. So, as blockchains enter into a world of much more modularity, one of the key focuses that we believe is that you should make sure that the technology stack that you choose matches the problems that you're trying to solve. There are real trade-offs between Arbitrum 1 and Arbitrum Nova. The introduction of the Data Availability Committee, while minimized, is still an additional security assumption compared to using Ethereum for data availability. What we've been recommending at Off-Chain Labs is teams that are very focused on DeFi. The Arbitrum 1 network is still cheap enough for your transactions to be economically viable, for your users to be economically viable. For example, if you're looking at doing a DEX trade, transaction fee is one component, slippage is another component, etc. Like 7 cents a transaction, I think, is the typical transaction cost right now on Arbitrum 1. Usually is okay, considering the size of the trades. Obviously, we want to always continue to bring that down. Stylus is going to play a key focus on that. EIP 4844, which I didn't really cover here, is also going to be significantly decreasing the cost of using Arbitrum 1. But obviously this is up to the DAO. Again, an example where Arbitrum DAO really has full control. I don't anticipate them ever getting rid of the rollup mechanism for Arbitrum 1 because that's one of the core security properties and the value propositions, especially amongst DeFi users.
Hi. The title of your talk was about sort of like partnerships and scaling the business. What would you say are, either like the timeline or the key partnerships or differentiators, however you want to answer, that has made thus far and will make Arbitrum more successful than, say, like a random other LTO?
Yeah, so I think the key, and I can't speak to the future because crypto's crazy. I'll talk to the past. So I think there were a couple of things when we launched Arbitrum that were unique. One was so first of all, the EVM experience, making it extremely easy to onboarding. At the time, now it seems like a given. At the time, was really the only rollup that had that. So that's very looking to the past. I think focusing on liquidity, especially for DeFi verticals and protocols, is going to be critical because it creates a massive flywheel effect, right? We see a lot of protocols launching on Arbitrum as a function of the liquidity that currently exists there. So our team currently is always looking at different ways to ensure that the interoperability of liquidity, the seamless of onboarding of liquidity is critical. Being there, I guess another thing that I would say that sort of we took a different approach than a lot of our peers and competitors is I would say we probably were over-indexed on being very Web3 and crypto native. When you look at 2021, 2022, there was a lot of focus on sort of growing into sort of traditional fintech, traditional businesses, loyalty programs. We thought it was very early. I would say we're probably looking a lot more now, preparing for 2024, 2025 to see a lot more adoption there. But I think understanding who the core audience, the core user base still is and designing a product that speaks to those user bases are key. And that will continue to evolve over time. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think that's probably were some of the driving, distinguishing factors in terms of how we launched the network was probably, insatiable focus on attracting liquidity sustainably and sticky and making sure that the builders that we were targeting were very committed to sort of the vision that we had because a lot of people come and go.
Hi. Actually had somebody reach out earlier today from one of the protocols that was up on your slide, and they have a proposal up, and they were actually asking if people knew the delegates. So I was just wondering if you had any insights into like what the communication channels are there between the protocols and the delegates, the voting for the ARB token delegates.
Yeah, definitely. So first of all the delegates are public, and the amount of tokens that they have are all public. I think tally.xyz is the governance interface that the foundation has established. I don't work at the foundation, but reaching out to the foundation, I think info at arbitrum.foundation. They can put you in touch with delegates, and they already are setting up hubs basically for delegates and DAO vote proposals to be able to interact. But it's much more on the foundation side than sort of the stuff that I focus on.
Can you help me out? Just behind you.
Thank you for the presentation. Really interesting, and congratulations for all the great job done so far.
Thank you.
Going back to the business growth side and business model and strategies, how you guys see potential collaborations with applications, specifically roll-ups protocols, right? It's clear that those roll-ups also will increase massively the computation space and block space on top of base layer chains. So do you have any clear, I would say, business model or partnership model to offer those protocols?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot to unpack there. The business model for the the Arbitrum DAO separately, which is sort of the orbit model, we can put that aside for a second. But the core business there is, if they live as layers 3s, Arbitrum 1 will act as sort of a central hub, like a Grand Central Station type model with all of these interoperabilities between different protocols that live on top of it. In terms of our business model, so at Off-Chain Labs, we're working with certain teams that are looking to build their own application chains and rollups. We announced actually that we're helping the Psy Foundation, which is a gaming metaverse that's building a number of games. And we're going to work for them as a service provider to help them with their rollup as well. There's also a bunch of rollup as a service providers, Conduit, Caldera, that are working on AltLayer as well, that are working on spinning up support for these sort of chains and networks. I think the business models across all of these different things are still quite interesting. To be completely honest, I think that the conversations around like everybody needing their own rollups or application-specific chains has probably gotten ahead of where we are from a demand perspective. You know, Arbitrum 1, I think, is typically at like 25% of capacity. Arbitrum Nova is at 5% of capacity. I think a lot of our peers, other than maybe the Polygon POS sidechain, really have a lot of capacity. I think what's happening now is, you know, it's the new narrative. It's very exciting. People are getting into it. But my personal opinion is that a lot of, you know, when I focus on all the core infrastructure, I think focusing on developer applications, building a user base that is very loyal, passionate to the product is probably the core focus that most of these, you know, application-focused teams should be doing. And then as their businesses scale, they should be thinking about, you know, how do we launch roll-ups? How do we work together? Who could we work with? And, you know, Off-Chain Labs is here, and the Arbitrum Foundation is obviously quite a nice framework for how to build on top of the DAO and work with service providers there. I hope that answers the question.
Any other question? No. Yeah. Another one.
So I wanted to go back to liquidity. You know, obviously there's like GMX. Like I don't know. Is there a particular thing that you think was like cemented you guys? And I'm just curious, like the story there. When were you like, okay, amazing, like we got it, we got liquidity. This is good.
I don't think that ever happens. First of all, like you know, as many people know, in crypto, there's no winners and losers, only temporary winners and losers, right? It's a hyper efficient market where liquidity moves quickly. I think that there's a couple of reasons why Arbitrum as a protocol has continued to hold its market share despite competitive headwinds. One is technical maturity. You know, if you look at any of the technical frameworks, you know, on L2B, there are other, you know, sort of bipartisan or nonpartisan websites. You know, the Arbitrum tech stack is, I think, by far the most mature of any of the rollups live today. You know, the DAO has full control of all contract governance. There's 2 points, I would say, of centralization still. One is the whitelisted validator set. They can burn that if they wanted to and open permissionlessly. They're waiting for a technical upgrade around a delay attack mechanism. The second is the existence of a multi-sig, which is, you know, a collection of public community members. Again, something that the DAO can control or burn, and is up for re-election at all times. There's a lot of technical maturity. I think for significant liquidity providers, you know, the average person doesn't know about this, but I think people who are, you know, bringing a lot of liquidity, they do care. A lot of the applications, I think, on Arbitrum are very focused and committed to the network, and they have sub-communities, right? Like a lot of what we're building is sub-communities that bring liquidity, and I think these things have network effects and flywheels. I think the way we approached working with builders and developers has probably what started that. I don't think it's cemented it anyway, to use your words, but I think it's the theme and the culture of the chain is very developer focused, which, you know, I think attracts a lot of sub-communities to make it their primary home, but also all the on-ramps, right? That's really important. We spent a lot of time, probably not so much now because a lot of that infrastructure is there, but if you go back to the work that we did at Off-Chain Labs in 2021, was, you know, Binance, Coinbase, all the major centralized exchanges, you can go directly into the Arbitrum network. You don't have to touch Ethereum, so that user onboarding experience is better. The fiat on-ramps, etc., the third-party bridges. So I think it's, you know, a lot of different things went into it, but I think that, you know, to think that it's cemented is a fool's errand. But you know, I think the maturity of the protocol probably really helped a lot.
Any other questions? No, I have one. So one of the centralized vector points today is the sequencer. So I think Arbitrum has voiced a desire to decentralize that over time. So there are a lot of different approaches to do that. For example, shared sequencers, L1-based sequencing, whitelist, some sequencers. So do you already have like a roadmap of like what the approach will be and those kind of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing I'll flag and plug is Harry, our co-founder, put out a thread. Harry Kolodner put out a thread on Twitter actually yesterday about sequencing. I think some of the centralization components are overstated. And what I mean by that is the Arbitrum sequencer really can't do anything other than, if it wanted to, is extract MEV, or for a certain time-bounded period, delay your transaction. It doesn't have the ability to set the price of a transaction to get it in. It doesn't have the ability to delay it for longer than, like, I think 20 minutes on a specific transaction. If it wanted to do it for longer, it would basically have to halt the entire chain. And all of this in the Arbitrum instance, for example, is all controlled by the DAO. So if the DAO ever, or the Security Council, ever wanted to vote to remove the Arbitrum sequencer, they can do it immediately, put in a new sequencer, et cetera, that wouldn't be malicious and wouldn't be censoring. So there are certain limitations. And I think the core focus and reason for decentralization are actually twofold. One is redundancies, to make sure, if there's a DevOps failure, that the chain doesn't go down. And the second is, ensuring that you don't have to trust anyone, they're not extracting MEV, but that's actually sort of the reality of the network. Where we've been focusing now a lot is, and a lot of my colleagues are actually talking about it at the conference, where we've been focusing is on decentralizing the sequencer by using a committee of sequencers that have to submit certificates, kind of like Nova in some ways, where they submit what their order of transactions is, and then the consensus is posted, and if the sequencer from the committee that posts the consensus deviates from the consensus of the committee, they get slashed. That's sort of how we're thinking about it now. There's other trade-offs that people are focusing on around auction mechanisms. We think that auction mechanisms are not ideal, and I'm not the most qualified on the team to talk about this, to be completely candid. But the issues with auction mechanisms is you're essentially incentivizing people to maximize MEV. So you should really be thinking about like MEV minimalization strategies in conjunction with that. And we've been doing a lot of research. One of my colleagues, Kaki, put out a paper called Time Boost, together with Ed Felton on our team as well, focusing basically on how do you have, MEV that cannot see into a private mempool but has the ability to submit transactions within, let's say, a 500 millisecond time frame of an advantage that they submit, a tip essentially. So we've been doing a lot of research around that, but much more focused on decentralizing and distributing the sequencer than I would say on the MEV components. And on shared sequencing, we're looking at it. There's a lot of trust assumptions that are introduced when you have shared sequencing. So that's much earlier stages of research for how it's not so complicated from what I understand doing it. It's complicated doing it without sort of sacrificing a lot of the trust assumptions that a rollup is supposed to institutionalize.
Interesting. Thank you. Last questions or no? Okay, then thank you for the talk, and
thank you everyone for
we can
coming.
close it here.